In the grand corridors of Buckingham Palace, where every footstep echoes with centuries of tradition and every whispered conversation could alter the course of history, two unlikely allies were about to make a decision that would shake the very foundations of royal protocol. Margaret Thornton, a seasoned nanny with calloused hands and a heart of steel, stood shoulder to shoulder with James Mitchell, a palace guard whose loyalty had never been questioned until now. The nursery door behind them housed not just any child, but the future of a nation. Yet on this fog-shrouded London morning, as official cars pulled up to the palace gates and men in expensive suits marched through the halls with papers that could change everything, Margaret and James found themselves asking a question that would haunt them forever. What if protecting the crown meant betraying the child? The answer they chose would cost them everything they had worked for, everything they believed in, and everything they thought they knew about duty, loyalty, and love. But sometimes the greatest act of service requires the courage to say no to those you've sworn to serve. This is their story, a tale of two ordinary people who discovered that extraordinary courage often comes disguised as simple human decency, and that the most important battles are sometimes fought not on distant battlefields, but in the quiet corners of power where children's futures hang in the balance. Margaret Thornton had been caring for royal children for 23 years when everything changed on that Tuesday morning in October. She had weathered scandals, divorces, and media storms that would have broken lesser women. Her hands, once soft and delicate, now bore the marks of countless midnight feedings, scraped knees, and tearful embraces. At 57, she had become more than a nanny to the royal family. She was a guardian of secrets, a keeper of traditions, and, most importantly, a fierce protector of the innocent. The morning started like any other in the East Wing nursery of Kensington Palace. Margaret arrived at precisely 6:30, as she had every day for the past 4 years since taking charge of young Prince Alexander's care. The 7-year-old heir to the throne was still sleeping peacefully in his bed, his golden hair catching the early morning light that filtered through the heavy curtains. Margaret moved quietly around the room, preparing his clothes for the day and organizing his schedule, which included private tutoring sessions, a writing lesson, and afternoon tea with his grandmother. James Mitchell stood at his usual post outside the nursery wing, his polished boots reflecting the marble floor beneath him. At 34, he was younger than most of the senior palace guards, but his dedication had earned him the prestigious assignment of protecting the royal nursery. His military background served him well in this role. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the palace guard 5 years ago. James took his responsibilities seriously, knowing that the safety of the future king rested partly in his hands. The relationship between Margaret and James had developed slowly over the years, built on mutual respect and shared dedication to their charge. They rarely spoke beyond necessary professional exchanges, but there was an understanding between them. Both recognized the weight of their responsibilities and the trust placed in them by the royal family. That morning, as Margaret helped Prince Alexander dress for breakfast, she noticed something unusual in the child's demeanor. He was quieter than normal, more withdrawn. When she asked him about it, he simply shrugged and mumbled something about strange dreams. Margaret had learned to read the subtle signs in children's behavior, and something told her that Alexander's unease wasn't just about dreams. The first sign that something was amiss came at 8:15 when Margaret received an unexpected call from the palace administrator's office. She was told that Alexander's schedule had been changed and that he would not be attending his regular morning activities. Instead, he was to remain in the nursery until further notice. No explanation was given, which was unusual. Margaret had worked in enough royal households to know that sudden schedule changes often signaled more significant developments. James noticed the increased activity in the palace corridors around the same time. Additional security personnel had been stationed at various points throughout the building, and several black sedans had arrived at the main entrance. He observed men in expensive suits, carrying briefcases and wearing expressions of grave seriousness, being escorted through the halls by senior palace officials. Something important was happening, but the nature of it remained unclear. By mid-morning, Margaret's unease had grown stronger. Alexander seemed to sense the tension in the air, becoming increasingly restless and asking repeatedly when he could go outside to play. She tried to keep him occupied with books and games, but her own anxiety was making it difficult to maintain the calm, nurturing environment she usually provided. The turning point came when Sir Richard Pembridge, the palace's chief administrator, arrived at the nursery accompanied by two men Margaret didn't recognize. Sir Richard was a tall, thin man in his 60s who had served the royal family for over 30 years. He had always been cordial to Margaret, but there was something different in his manner today, something cold and formal that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Miss Thornton," Sir Richard began, his voice carrying an official tone she had never heard him use before, "we need to discuss Prince Alexander's immediate future. There have been some developments that require careful handling." Margaret instinctively moved closer to Alexander, who was playing quietly with his toy soldiers on the carpet. The child looked up at the men with curious eyes, sensing the gravity of the moment, even if he couldn't understand its implications. One of the unfamiliar men stepped forward. He was middle-aged with gray hair and sharp features, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. "Miss Thornton, I am Mr. Blackwood from the Cabinet Office. This is Dr. Harrison, a child psychologist specializing in high-profile cases. We're here to discuss arrangements for Prince Alexander's care during what we anticipate will be a challenging period for the royal family." Margaret's protective instincts immediately flared. In her experience, when government officials showed up unannounced with child psychologists, it rarely meant anything good for the child involved. "What kind of arrangements?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. Sir Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There have been some serious allegations made against members of the royal family. While we believe these claims to be unfounded, the investigation process will require certain precautions to be taken regarding Prince Alexander's welfare and security." Dr. Harrison spoke up, his voice professionally warm but somehow unsettling. "We feel it would be in the prince's best interest to be temporarily relocated to a more secure environment while these matters are resolved. We've identified a suitable facility where he can receive appropriate care and protection." Margaret felt her blood run cold. "A facility? You're talking about taking him away from his home?" "It's merely a precautionary measure," Mr. Blackwood interjected smoothly. "The facility is well-equipped to handle high-profile cases and would ensure Prince Alexander's safety and well-being during this difficult time." But Margaret had heard enough euphemisms in her years of service to recognize what was really being proposed. They wanted to remove Alexander from the palace, from everyone he knew and trusted, and place him in some kind of institutional care. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what allegations could be so serious as to warrant such drastic action. "Where exactly is this facility?" she demanded. The men exchanged glances before Dr. Harrison responded. "It's a private institution in the countryside, about 2 hours from London. It's very discreet and has experience with children from prominent families who require special protection." Margaret's heart sank. She had heard whispers over the years about such places, institutions where inconvenient children of powerful families could be hidden away from public scrutiny. The idea of sending Alexander, a sensitive and intelligent child who thrived on routine and familiar faces, to such a place filled her with horror. "When would this transfer take place?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "We're prepared to make the arrangements immediately," Mr. Blackwood replied. "Time is of the essence, given the sensitive nature of the situation." Margaret looked down at Alexander, who had stopped playing with his toys and was listening intently to the adult conversation. His young face showed confusion and growing fear as he picked up on the tension in the room. She had spent 4 years building trust with this child, helping him navigate the complexities of his unique position in life, and now these strangers wanted to uproot him from everything he knew. "I'll need some time to prepare him," Margaret said carefully, buying herself precious minutes to think. "Of course," Sir Richard replied. "We understand this is a significant adjustment. However, We do need to move forward with the arrangements today. As the men continued discussing logistics, Margaret's mind was working frantically. Something about this entire situation felt wrong. The suddenness of it, the vague explanations, the insistence on immediate action. None of it aligned with the careful, methodical approach the royal family typically took to any changes in Alexander's care. She excused herself to gather some of Alexander's belongings, but instead stepped into the hallway where James was still standing guard. His expression told her that he had overheard at least parts of the conversation through the door. "James," she whispered urgently, "we need to talk." He nodded grimly and followed her to a small alcove away from the nursery door. "I've been watching the activity all morning," he said quietly. "Whatever's happening, it's big. I've never seen this level of security mobilization inside the palace." Margaret quickly explained what the men had told her about relocating Alexander to a facility. As she spoke, she watched James's expression grow increasingly troubled. "That doesn't make sense," he said when she finished. "If there were genuine security concerns, the protocol would be to increase protection here at the palace, not move him to some unknown location. I should have been briefed on any changes to security arrangements." "That's what I thought too," Margaret replied. "James, I don't trust this. Something feels very wrong about the whole situation." They stood in silence for a moment, both grappling with the implications of what they were considering. As royal employees, they had sworn oaths of loyalty and obedience to the crown. Questioning the decisions of senior officials went against everything they had been taught about their roles. But as they looked back toward the nursery door, behind which sat a 7-year-old child who trusted them to keep him safe, both Margaret and James realized that some loyalties ran deeper than oaths and paychecks. Sometimes protecting someone meant protecting them from the very system that claimed to have their best interests at heart. The conversation in the nursery was winding down, and Margaret knew she would soon be expected to begin preparing Alexander for his departure. She looked at James, seeing her own resolve reflected in his steady gaze. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "I'm thinking that maybe it's time to find out exactly who we're really supposed to be keeping out of that nursery." The weight of their decision settled over them like a heavy cloak. They both understood that once they took this step, there would be no going back. Their careers, their reputations, perhaps even their freedom could be at stake. But as they heard Alexander's voice calling for Margaret from inside the nursery, they knew they had already made their choice. The real question now was whether they would be strong enough to see it through. Margaret returned to the nursery with James close behind her, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Alexander looked up from his toys with the trusting smile that had melted her heart countless times over the past 4 years. In that moment, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. "Gentlemen," she announced to the 3 officials, "I'm afraid I cannot support the decision to relocate Prince Alexander at this time." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Sir Richard's eyebrows rose in surprise, while Mr. Blackwood's expression hardened noticeably. Dr. Harrison maintained his professional composure, but Margaret caught a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, cross his features. "Miss Thornton," Sir Richard said carefully, "I'm not sure you understand the gravity of the situation. This isn't a matter for discussion. The arrangements have been made." "Then perhaps you could explain exactly what allegations have been made and why Prince Alexander needs to be removed from his home," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "As his primary caregiver, I believe I have a right to understand the circumstances that would justify such a drastic step." Mr. Blackwood stepped forward, his tone becoming noticeably colder. "The details are classified, Miss Thornton. Your job is to follow instructions, not question them." "My job," Margaret replied firmly, "is to protect the welfare of the child in my care. And removing a 7-year-old from his home, his routine, and everyone he trusts does not seem to serve his welfare." James cleared his throat from his position by the door. "Sir, I would also like clarification on the security aspects of this relocation. I haven't received any briefings about threats that would necessitate moving Prince Alexander off the palace grounds." The officials exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Margaret recognized the look. It was the same expression she had seen on the faces of adults throughout her career when they were caught in uncomfortable situations involving children. The look of people who had been hoping to handle matters quietly and were now being forced to explain themselves. Dr. Harrison attempted to regain control of the situation. "Miss Thornton, I understand your concerns, but sometimes what seems disruptive in the short term is actually in the child's best long-term interests. The facility I mentioned has excellent resources, and what facility exactly?" Margaret interrupted. "What's its name? Who runs it? What experience do they have with children Alexander's age?" The psychologist hesitated, and in that hesitation, Margaret saw confirmation of her worst fears. These men were asking her to hand over a child to people and places they couldn't or wouldn't properly identify. Alexander, who had been listening to the adult conversation with growing anxiety, suddenly stood up and moved to Margaret's side. His small hand slipped into hers, and she could feel his trembling. "Nanny Maggie," he whispered, using the pet name he had given her years ago. "Are they going to take me away?" The innocent question hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret squeezed his hand gently and looked down into his worried blue eyes. "No one is taking you anywhere without a very good reason, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but determined. Sir Richard's composure began to crack. "Miss Thornton, you are being insubordinate. I could have you dismissed immediately." "Then dismiss me," Margaret replied quietly. "But I won't be party to traumatizing a child based on vague allegations and secret arrangements." James stepped forward, his military bearing evident in every line of his posture. "Sir, with respect, the security protocols for Prince Alexander's protection are clear. Any relocation would require proper briefings and coordination with the security detail. I received neither. Until I do, I cannot in good conscience allow any unauthorized personnel to remove the prince from this secure location." Mr. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. We have full authority here." "Then show us that authority," Margaret challenged. "Show us the proper documentation, the court orders, the security assessments that justify removing a child from his home. Show us credentials for this mysterious facility and the people who would be caring for him." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander pressed closer to Margaret's side, instinctively seeking protection from the tension in the room. She wrapped her arm around him protectively, a gesture that seemed to infuriate Dr. Harrison. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be," the psychologist said tersely. "The child attachment to you is clearly unhealthy if you're willing to put your own relationship with him above his safety and well-being." Margaret felt a surge of anger at the professional manipulation attempt. She had seen similar tactics used before, questioning the motives and competence of caregivers who dare to advocate for their charges. Dr. Harrison, my attachment to Alexander is based on 4 years of caring for him daily, understanding his needs, and building the trust that every child requires from their caregivers. If you think that's unhealthy, perhaps you should examine your own understanding of child development. The confrontation was interrupted by a knock on the nursery door. James opened it to reveal Lady Catherine Pemberton, Alexander's aunt, and one of the few members of the extended royal family whom Margaret genuinely respected. Lady Catherine was in her 40s, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Lady Catherine said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what she was interrupting. "But I was hoping to spend some time with my nephew this afternoon." Sir Richard looked distinctly uncomfortable at her appearance. "Lady Catherine, we're in the middle of some administrative matters. Perhaps another time would be more appropriate." "Administrative matters involving my 7-year-old nephew?" Lady Catherine's voice carried the particular authority that came from royal blood and decades of navigating palace politics. "How interesting. I wasn't aware of any scheduled administrative matters regarding Alexander's care." Mr. Blackwood attempted to take control. "Lady Catherine, we're handling some sensitive security issues. I'm sure you understand the need for discretion." Lady Catherine's expression grew arctic. "Mr. Blackwood, isn't it? From the cabinet office. Yes, I remember you from the briefings last month. And Dr. Harrison, I believe we've met at several charity functions. Gentlemen, what exactly are these security issues that require my nephew's nanny? And Gerda looked so concerned. Margaret felt a surge of hope. Lady Catherine had always been protective of Alexander, and unlike many of the adults in his life, she seemed to genuinely prioritize his emotional well-being alongside his royal duties. They want to remove Alexander from the palace, Margaret said directly. They're talking about placing him in some kind of facility, but they won't provide details about where or why. Lady Catherine's face went pale, then flushed with barely contained fury. I beg your pardon? Sir Richard stammered slightly. Lady Catherine, there have been some allegations that require careful investigation. We feel it would be prudent to ensure Prince Alexander's protection during this period. What allegations? Lady Catherine demanded. And who, exactly, authorized the removal of a member of the royal family from palace grounds without consulting the senior royals? The question hung in the air like a sword. Margaret realized that Lady Catherine had identified the crucial flaw in the officials' plan. They were acting without proper royal authorization. No wonder they had been so vague and insistent on immediate action. Dr. Harrison attempted to redirect the conversation. Lady Catherine, as a family member, surely you want what's best for Prince Alexander. The facility we have in mind, the facility you refuse to identify, Lady Catherine interrupted coldly. Dr. Harrison, in my experience, legitimate child protection services are quite transparent about their facilities and procedures. The fact that you seem reluctant to provide basic information raises serious questions about your intentions. Alexander had been listening to the heated exchange with growing distress. Tears were beginning to form in his eyes as he looked between the adults arguing about his future, as if he weren't even in the room. Margaret's heart broke as she watched him struggle to understand why strange men wanted to take him away from everything he knew. Stop, Alexander said suddenly, his young voice cutting through the adult arguments. Please stop fighting about me. I don't want to go away. I want to stay with Nanny Maggie and Uncle James. He had nicknamed James Uncle James, despite the guard's protest that it wasn't proper protocol. The child's distress seemed to galvanize both Margaret and James. They moved instinctively to shield him from the arguing adults, their protective stances making their position crystal clear. Lady Catherine knelt down to Alexander's level. Sweetheart, she said gently, nobody's going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. Not without a very good reason, and not without making sure you understand what's happening and why. She stood and faced the officials with the full weight of her royal authority. Gentlemen, I'm ordering you to provide complete documentation of your authority to relocate Prince Alexander, including the specific allegations you mentioned, the court orders authorizing his removal, and detailed information about this facility you're so eager to use. You have 1 hour. Mr. Blackwood's face was now bright red with frustration. Lady Catherine, you don't have the authority to— I have more authority regarding this child than anyone in this room, except his parents, Lady Catherine snapped. And since his parents aren't here to protect his interests, I'm acting in their stead. 1 hour, gentlemen. Documentation or departure. Your choice. The three officials huddled together in hurried whispers while Margaret, James, and Lady Catherine formed a protective circle around Alexander. The child had stopped crying, but his face remained pale and anxious. After several minutes of heated discussion, Sir Richard approached the group. Lady Catherine, we will need to consult with higher authorities regarding your demands. In the meantime, we expect Prince Alexander to remain available for relocation as soon as the proper paperwork is arranged. Prince Alexander will remain in the care of his authorized caregivers in his regular residence until such time as proper legal documentation is provided, Lady Catherine replied firmly. Miss Thornton and Mr. Mitchell will continue their duties as assigned. The officials left the nursery, but their parting looks suggested this was far from over. As soon as the door closed behind them, Lady Catherine sank into one of the nursery chairs, suddenly looking every one of her 46 years. This is worse than I thought, she murmured. Margaret, James, I need you both to understand what you've gotten yourselves into. These men aren't just acting on their own initiative. Someone with significant power is pushing for Alexander's removal from the palace. Margaret knelt beside Alexander, who was finally beginning to relax now that the strange men were gone. What kind of allegations could be so serious? She asked. Lady Catherine glanced meaningfully at Alexander, who was building with his blocks again, but clearly still listening. Let's just say that certain people might find it convenient to have Alexander somewhere less visible while they sort out some very complicated family matters. The implication was chilling. Margaret realized they weren't just dealing with misguided child protection services. They were caught in the middle of a power struggle that could determine Alexander's entire future. James spoke up from his position by the door. Lady Catherine, what resources do we have? If they come back with documentation, even questionable documentation, will we be able to stop them? Lady Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering their options. I have some influence, but I'll be honest with you both. If powerful enough people want Alexander removed from the palace, there may be limits to what I can do through official channels. Margaret felt her stomach clench with fear. So what do we do? Lady Catherine looked at Alexander, who was humming quietly to himself as he played, blissfully unaware of the adult complexities swirling around him. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. We might have to consider alternatives to official channels. The next 24 hours passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and tension. Margaret maintained Alexander's regular routine as much as possible. Breakfast at 8, lessons with his tutor, a walk in the palace gardens, while James coordinated quietly with trusted members of the security team to monitor any unusual activity. Lady Catherine had spent the evening making discreet phone calls from her private residence, trying to piece together the political machinations behind the sudden push to relocate Alexander. Margaret barely slept that night, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. She kept checking on Alexander, who seemed to sense the adult's anxiety despite their efforts to shield him from it. The child had been clingy all day, asking repeatedly if the strange men were coming back. Each time, Margaret had reassured him with more confidence than she felt. Lady Catherine arrived early the following morning with news that confirmed Margaret's worst suspicions. She requested a private meeting in the small sitting room adjacent to the nursery, where she, Margaret, and James could speak freely while keeping Alexander in sight through the open doorway. I've learned the nature of the allegations, Lady Catherine began quietly, her face grave. There are claims that Alexander has been exposed to inappropriate influences within the palace itself. The allegations are vague, but serious enough to provide legal justification for his removal, especially if the right people push for emergency protective custody. Margaret felt her heart sink. Inappropriate influences? What does that even mean? It means they're suggesting that people close to Alexander, potentially including his regular caregivers, may have exposed him to harmful situations or behaviors, Lady Catherine explained. The beauty of such vague allegations is that they're almost impossible to disprove quickly, which gives whoever is behind this time to accomplish whatever their real goal might be. James leaned forward in his chair. Lady Catherine, with respect, this feels orchestrated. The timing, the vague allegations, the pressure for immediate action, it's textbook manipulation. Lady Catherine nodded grimly. I agree completely. But here's what's truly troubling. I've been unable to identify who is actually driving this initiative. The Cabinet Office claims they're responding to concerns raised by Child Protective Services, but when I contacted those services, they indicated they were following up on reports from government officials. Everyone is pointing fingers at someone else. Margaret watched Alexander through the doorway as he arranged his toy knights in careful formations on the nursery carpet. The sight of him playing so innocently while adults plotted his removal filled her with fierce determination. So what you're telling us is that anonymous people are using anonymous allegations to justify taking a child away from everyone he knows and trusts. That's exactly what I'm telling you, Lady Catherine replied. And I'm also telling you that my official channels of influence may not be sufficient to stop this if they present the right paperwork to the right judges. The three adults sat in heavy silence for several minutes, each grappling with the implications of their situation. Finally, James spoke up. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about alternatives to official channels," he said carefully. "What exactly did you mean?" Lady Catherine glanced toward the doorway where Alexander was playing, then back to her companions. "I meant that sometimes protecting someone requires actions that exist outside the normal systems of authority and law. I meant that if official channels fail us, we might need to consider options that would make us fugitives." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what Lady Catherine was suggesting. "You're talking about taking Alexander and disappearing." "I'm talking about keeping him safe by any means necessary," Lady Catherine corrected. "My contacts have identified several possibilities. Safe houses, private security, even arrangements in other countries where certain powerful interests couldn't reach him." Margaret's mind reeled at the enormity of what was being discussed. Taking a member of the royal family into hiding would be kidnapping in the eyes of the law, regardless of their motives. They would be branded as criminals hunted by both law enforcement and intelligence services. Their lives, as they knew them, would be over. But as she watched Alexander carefully arranging his toys, she found herself considering the unthinkable. What was her life worth compared to the safety and well-being of the child she had come to love as her own? James seemed to be wrestling with similar thoughts. "Lady Catherine, if we were to consider such a drastic step, what kind of resources would we have? We couldn't exactly hide a recognizable royal child in a bed and breakfast." "I have resources," Lady Catherine replied quietly. "Significant financial resources and connections to people who specialize in keeping high-profile individuals safe from unwanted attention. But I won't lie to you, it would mean giving up everything else in your lives, potentially permanently." The conversation was interrupted by Alexander's voice calling from the nursery. "Nanny Maggie, can you help me with this castle? The drawbridge is stuck." Margaret smiled despite her heavy heart and went to help him with his toy. As she knelt beside him on the carpet, working to free the tiny plastic drawbridge, Alexander looked up at her with complete trust and affection. "Nanny Maggie," he said quietly, "are you worried about something? You look sad." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. This child, with his innocent perception and caring heart, deserved so much better than to become a pawn in adult power games. "I'm just thinking about some grown-up things, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." "Is it about those men who wanted to take me away yesterday?" Alexander asked with the directness that only children possessed. Margaret hesitated, unsure how much truth a 7-year-old could handle. "Alexander, if some people want to take you somewhere you didn't want to go, and the adults who care about you had to make some very difficult choices to keep you safe, would you trust us to make the right decisions?" Alexander considered this seriously, his young face scrunched in concentration. "Would you come with me? And Uncle James and Aunt Catherine?" "If we could, yes. We would all stay together." "Then I would trust you," Alexander said simply, "because you always keep me safe, and you never lie to me." The child's faith in her nearly broke Margaret's heart. She hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair and memorizing the feeling of his small body in her arms. Whatever happened next, she would not betray that trust. When she returned to the sitting room, Lady Catherine and James were deep in discussion about logistics. They looked up as she entered, and she saw her own resolve reflected in their faces. "I take it we've all reached the same conclusion," Lady Catherine said quietly. Margaret nodded. "If they come back today with papers and orders, and if those papers would take Alexander away from us, then we don't let them leave with him." James straightened in his chair with military precision. "What's the plan?" Lady Catherine pulled out a small notebook filled with her neat handwriting. "I've been working on contingencies all night. If we decide to act, we would need to move quickly and decisively. There's a window of opportunity this afternoon when the regular security shift change occurs. Most of the palace staff will be attending the quarterly briefing, which means fewer people around to notice unusual activity." She outlined her plan with methodical precision. James would use his security access to disable certain surveillance equipment and create a brief gap in monitoring. Margaret would prepare Alexander for what she would tell him was a special adventure. Lady Catherine would have a vehicle waiting in the service area behind the kitchen gardens, along with supplies and documentation for their immediate needs. Once we leave the palace grounds, we become committed, Lady Catherine warned. There will be no going back, no explaining ourselves, no second chances. We'll be branded as criminals and fugitives. Margaret thought about her comfortable flat in London, her small circle of friends, her carefully built reputation in childcare circles. Everything she had worked for over decades would be destroyed. But then she thought about Alexander being dragged away by strangers to some unknown facility, and the choice became clear. "I'm in," she said firmly. James nodded his agreement. The boy deserves better than to become a political football. If this is what it takes to protect him, then this is what we do. They spent the next hour reviewing every detail of the plan, identifying potential problems and backup options. Margaret found herself marveling at Lady Catherine's thoroughness and James's tactical expertise. If they were going to commit such a desperate act, at least they were doing it with careful preparation. As they finalized their plans, Sir Richard arrived with the same two officials from the previous day, along with several additional men in suits. This time, they carried official-looking documents and wore expressions of grim determination. "Miss Thornton, Mr. Mitchell," Sir Richard announced formally. "We have the proper authorization to relocate Prince Alexander. Please have him ready for departure within the hour." Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she realized their moment of truth had arrived. She looked at the papers Sir Richard held, noting the impressive seals and signatures, while knowing that the legitimacy of the documents was irrelevant to their decision. "May I see the documentation?" Lady Catherine requested, stepping forward with royal authority. Mr. Blackwood handed her the papers with obvious reluctance. Lady Catherine studied them carefully, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she read. "These orders are signed by Judge Morrison," she said finally. "Emergency protective custody based on allegations of emotional abuse and exposure to inappropriate influences." Margaret felt sick to her stomach. The allegations were broad enough to include virtually any aspect of Alexander's care, making them nearly impossible to refute quickly. Whoever had orchestrated this had done their homework. "The transport vehicle is waiting outside," Dr. Harrison announced. "We'll need Prince Alexander's personal items packed immediately." As the officials began making preparations for Alexander's removal, Margaret caught Lady Catherine's eye. The slight nod she received confirmed that their alternative plan was now their only option. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. But as she looked toward the nursery where Alexander was playing, trusting in the adults who had promised to keep him safe, she knew they had no choice but to cross that line. The real battle was about to begin. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she entered the nursery to collect Alexander's belongings, knowing that every item she packed might be scrutinized later as evidence of premeditation. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was packing a bag to kidnap a child she was trying to protect from kidnapping. Alexander looked up from his books as she began gathering his clothes. "Are we going on a trip, Nanny Maggie?" "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than her nerves. "A special adventure, just like we talked about. Remember how we said you should trust the grown-ups who care about you?" Alexander nodded solemnly. "Will there be other children where we're going?" The innocent question nearly broke Margaret's heart. She had no idea what their destination would hold, whether Alexander would ever again experience the normal childhood interactions he craved. "I don't know yet, but I promise we'll make sure you're happy and safe, no matter where we go." In the sitting room, Lady Catherine was making final preparations while James coordinated with the handful of security personnel he trusted. The plan required split-second timing and relied heavily on the loyalty of people who were risking their own careers by helping them. The palace's quarterly security briefing was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, which would draw most of the senior staff away from their posts. James had arranged for a brief maintenance issue with the surveillance system in the East Wing, creating a 15-minute window where their movements wouldn't be recorded. Lady Catherine's driver, a former military man named Thomas who had served the royal family for over a decade, was positioned with a nondescript sedan in the service area. As the officials in the main corridor grew increasingly impatient about the delay in Alexander's preparation, the three conspirators made their final preparations. Lady Catherine had distributed untraceable mobile phones and emergency cash to both Margaret and James. She had also provided them with new identification documents, not forgeries, she assured them, but legitimate papers issued through certain diplomatic channels that preferred not to ask too many questions. "Once we leave the grounds, we separate," Lady Catherine reminded them quietly. "Margaret and Alexander will come with me to the first safe house. James, you'll take the alternate route and meet us there tomorrow. If anyone is captured or compromised, the others continue with the plan. Is everyone clear on that?" Margaret felt a chill at the clinical way Lady Catherine discussed their potential capture, but she nodded her understanding. They had all accepted that this mission might end with some or all of them in prison. The moment of action arrived sooner than expected when Sir Richard appeared in the doorway, looking increasingly agitated. "Miss Thornton, we really must proceed immediately. The transport schedule cannot be delayed any further." "Of course," Margaret replied smoothly, lifting Alexander's small suitcase. "Alexander, are you ready for our adventure?" The child took her hand trustingly, and Margaret had to fight back tears at his complete faith in her. As they walked toward the main corridor where the officials were waiting, she caught James's eye and saw him give an almost imperceptible nod. The surveillance gap had begun. What happened next unfolded with the surreal quality of a well-rehearsed play. Instead of turning toward the main entrance where the officials expected them to go, Margaret suddenly guided Alexander down the smaller corridor toward the East Wing service areas. "Miss Thornton," Sir Richard called sharply. "Where are you going?" "I forgot Alexander's special blanket," Margaret called back, continuing to walk rapidly. "He can't sleep without it. Just give me one moment." James, positioned strategically near the corridor junction, suddenly stumbled and fell heavily, creating enough commotion to distract the officials for crucial seconds. As he struggled to his feet with apparent difficulty, apologizing profusely for his clumsiness, Margaret and Alexander disappeared around the corner. Lady Catherine, who had been discussing some trivial matter with Dr. Harrison, chose that moment to launch into a detailed complaint about the inadequate information they had provided about Alexander's destination. Her imperious tone and rapid-fire questions demanded immediate attention from the officials, further delaying their realization that something was amiss. Margaret moved through the palace's service corridors with practiced efficiency, her intimate knowledge of the building serving her well. Alexander trotted beside her, trusting but increasingly puzzled by their route. "Nanny Maggie, this isn't the way to the front door," he observed. "We're taking a special secret way," Margaret explained, hoping her voice conveyed adventure rather than desperation. "It's more fun than the regular doors, don't you think?" They reached the service entrance just as Thomas pulled the sedan into position. Lady Catherine appeared moments later, moving with remarkable speed for someone in her 40s. The three of them bundled Alexander into the back seat between Margaret and Lady Catherine, and Thomas immediately pulled away from the palace. Alexander pressed his face to the window as they drove through the service gates, waving goodbye to the palace guards who waved back cheerfully, unaware that they were witnessing a kidnapping. "Will we come back soon?" he asked. Lady Catherine and Margaret exchanged glances over his head. "Sweetheart," Lady Catherine said gently, "this adventure might last longer than we originally thought. But remember what we told you about trusting the adults who care about you." "I remember," Alexander replied. "Are those men still going to try to take me to that place I didn't want to go?" "Not anymore," Margaret said firmly. "Whatever happens on our adventure, you won't have to go anywhere you don't want to go." The first hour of their escape passed in relative calm as Thomas navigated London's busy streets with the skill of someone who knew every shortcut and alternate route. Lady Catherine used her encrypted phone to coordinate with contacts who were preparing their first safe house, while Margaret tried to keep Alexander entertained with stories and games. The gravity of their situation hit home when Lady Catherine's phone buzzed with an emergency alert. She answered it tersely, listened for several minutes, then hung up with a grim expression. "They've realized we're gone," she announced quietly. "The palace has been locked down, and they're conducting a full search of the grounds." James managed to slip away during the confusion, but his absence has been noted. "We're officially fugitives now." Margaret felt her stomach drop as the reality of their situation sank in completely. There would be no explanation, no negotiation, no second chances. They had committed themselves to a path that led either to Alexander's safety or to their own destruction. Alexander seemed to sense the change in mood among the adults. "Nanny Maggie, are we in trouble?" Margaret looked down into his worried blue eyes and made a decision that surprised even herself. "Alexander, you know how in your storybooks, sometimes the good people have to break rules to protect someone they love? Like when a knight rescues the princess, even though the king says he can't. Exactly like that. We've had to break some rules to keep you safe, which means some people might be angry with us for a while. But everything we're doing is because we love you and want to protect you." Alexander considered this with the seriousness that only children could bring to complex situations. "Will Uncle James get in trouble too?" "Probably," Margaret admitted. "But he made the same choice we did because he cares about you." "Then we're all brave knights together," Alexander declared with satisfaction. "And brave knights always win in the end." Lady Catherine smiled for the first time since their escape began. "Yes, sweetheart. Brave knights always win in the end." As London faded behind them and they headed toward the countryside, Margaret reflected on the events that had brought them to this point. 48 hours ago, she had been a respectable royal nanny with a predictable life and secure future. Now she was a fugitive from justice, traveling under an assumed name with a kidnapped prince and no idea what tomorrow would bring. But as she watched Alexander doze against her shoulder, his small hand still clutching his favorite toy knight, she felt a peace she hadn't expected. For the first time in days, he looked truly relaxed and safe. Whatever the cost to her own life, that alone made their desperate gamble worthwhile. The safe house turned out to be a modest cottage in the Cotswolds, owned by one of Lady Catherine's many discreet contacts. It was isolated enough to avoid casual observation, but comfortable enough to serve as a temporary home for a child. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Davies who asked no questions and offered no judgments, had prepared the house with groceries, clean linens, and even some books and toys appropriate for a 7-year-old. James arrived the following evening as planned, bringing news of the investigation. The palace had released a carefully worded statement about Prince Alexander being relocated for security reasons, but the media was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. More importantly, the search for them was being conducted by both official law enforcement and private security firms, suggesting that powerful interests were indeed behind Alexander's intended removal. The good news is that public sympathy seems to be shifting in our favor, James reported. Someone leaked information about the vague allegations and the rush to remove Alexander from his home. Child welfare advocates are asking pointed questions about the process. Lady Catherine poured tea for the adults while Alexander played with his new toys in the sitting room, seemingly adapting to their new circumstances with the resilience that children possessed. The bad news is that sympathy won't protect us from criminal charges if we're caught. Margaret watched Alexander build elaborate castles with his blocks, narrating complex stories about brave knights defending innocent people. How long can we realistically stay hidden? Long enough for the truth to come out, Lady Catherine replied with more confidence than Margaret thought the situation warranted. My contacts are working on identifying who was really behind the push to remove Alexander. Once we expose their motives, the legal landscape changes dramatically. Over the following weeks, their small household settled into an unusual, but surprisingly harmonious routine. Margaret continued Alexander's education with materials Lady Catherine had acquired, while James maintained security and Thomas handled their logistics. Lady Catherine coordinated their support network and gathered intelligence about the ongoing investigation. Alexander thrived in their unconventional family structure, seeming happier and more relaxed than Margaret had seen him in months. Away from the rigid protocols of palace life, he was free to be a normal child, playing in the garden, helping Mrs. Davies with her chickens, and sleeping peacefully through the night without the anxiety that had plagued him before their escape. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after their disappearance, when Lady Catherine's investigators uncovered the true motivation behind the attempt to remove Alexander. A complex financial scandal involving several senior government officials had created a situation where Alexander's presence in the palace made certain people uncomfortable. His removal wasn't about protecting him. It was about removing a potential witness to conversations and activities he was too young to understand, but old enough to remember. The revelation, when it became public, created a political firestorm that vindicated their desperate actions. The officials who had tried to remove Alexander were arrested on corruption charges, and the emergency custody orders were declared invalid by the courts. Margaret, James, and Lady Catherine were offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for their testimony about the attempted kidnapping. More importantly, Alexander was declared safe to return to palace life under new security arrangements that included Margaret and James in their original roles. The night before their return to London, Margaret sat with Alexander in the cottage garden, watching him chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Are you ready to go home, sweetheart?" Alexander caught a firefly gently in his cupped hands, watched it glow for a moment, then released it back into the evening air. "This was a good adventure, Nanny Maggie, but I think I'm ready to go back to my real home now." "What was the best part of our adventure?" Margaret asked. Alexander thought seriously for a moment. "Learning that the people who love me will always keep me safe, even when it's really hard." As they prepared to return to their normal lives, Margaret reflected on the lessons of their extraordinary weeks in hiding. Sometimes protecting someone meant breaking the rules. Sometimes love required courage that went beyond duty or obligation. And sometimes the most important battles were fought not in palaces or courtrooms, but in the quiet moments when people chose to do what was right rather than what was easy. The question they had asked themselves at the beginning, who were they keeping out of the nursery, had been answered in ways they never expected. They weren't just keeping out men with official papers and vague allegations. They were keeping out anyone who would use a child as a pawn in adult games of power and politics. And in the end, the brave knights did win, just as Alexander had predicted they would.